welcome to our show today. My name is Cindy Speaker. I have with me as my guest Attorney Bill Kowalczyk of Michael J. O'Connor and Associates. Bill, thanks for being with us today.
Cindy, you're welcome. Great to be here. Always good to see you and discuss workers' comp.
I appreciate that. Well, we're going to talk a little today about the traveling employee, which is interesting, not something you would normally think about. But let me start off with the first question here. Can you explain in what locations and under what circumstances Pennsylvania residents are covered and under workers' compensation?
Right. This is a really complicated question, and I can tell you there are reams of cases and statutes on this. Statutes, no statues. Anyway, but I'm going to hit the basics. And the first thing to know is the concept of jurisdiction. So jurisdiction is a concept in every area of the law, and certainly in workers' comp. And what jurisdiction means is that a court and the state has the right to hear that case. So that's true with Pennsylvania workers' comp. So now, Pennsylvania has jurisdiction in every workers' comp case where the injury happens in Pennsylvania. Okay. So that means Pennsylvania residents who work in PA, get hurt in PA, we have jurisdiction. Non-Pennsylvania residents who happen to be here in the course and scope of their employment and are hurt here also have a case in Pennsylvania. Now, they may have a case back where they live, too, as well, depending on their own state's laws, but they certainly have one here.
That's
so what
interesting.
We find is often, there are multiple states sometimes that could hear a case, more than one. So now that's an easy concept, and a lot of the times we see out-of-state employees get hurt here is in the trucking industry, for one. They're passing through, coming up Route 81, and there's an accident. And with the onset of fracking in Pennsylvania, we've seen a lot of people who are just here temporarily. They're from Oklahoma or Texas, and they're just here to do a job. They get hurt. They go back to their house in San Antonio, and we're representing them here in Pennsylvania. So that's a common thing that we see. But it gets way more complicated than that. And here's why. Because it's easy, if the injury happened here, to know that you have jurisdiction here. But what if it didn't happen here? Okay, so what if it happened somewhere else? Now, that's what we call the extraterritorial provisions of the Pennsylvania Workers' Compensation Act. Now, to have extraterritorial provisions, you have to meet the requirements of the law. And what that means is if you don't get hurt in Pennsylvania, you might still be covered. It just depends on the circumstances. So the provisions are basically this of the law, that the employment is, number one, it could be principally localized in Pennsylvania. So you work in Pennsylvania. Now, I like to use myself as an example. Say, for instance, my work is here in Pennsylvania. It's localized here. The offices we have are here. The cases I represent people in are all here. But occasionally we go out of state. What if I go to New Jersey for a deposition? Or what if I go to California for a conference? I was in LA 2 years ago to speak at a conference. That is work, but I'm not in Pennsylvania.
Right.
What if I fell down a flight of stairs in that conference center? As long as I was sober, I'd be covered. Of course, there are times when someone is out of the office and they're straying from their job. They're not covered. For instance, intoxication, etc. But my work is here, so I'm covered in California or in New Jersey or wherever I go. Depending on what I'm doing at the time, of course, I can't stray too far from the purpose of why I'm there.
Now, are you covered by Pennsylvania workers' comp laws or California if that happens?
In that case, again, there's concurrent jurisdiction.
Okay.
I could make a claim under California law if I wanted, but, I'm going to come back to PA and make the claim here. It's more convenient, whatever. Yeah. But that would be an example of concurrent jurisdiction.
Okay.
So what about if you have a job that is not principally localized in Pennsylvania? And a lot of people have that. And these people are, what we generally consider traveling employees.
Right.
And if the traveling employee gets hurt outside the state, well, then what? A lot of these people are truck drivers. Some are sales reps. I had a client who went all over the country setting up dollar stores. He was in a different state every month.
Wow.
So if, in fact, you can prove that you had a contract of hire in the state of Pennsylvania, and that means you got hired here, that can be very tricky. Now, it's easy if, your company is in Bloomsburg and you go in and they interview you and they hire you in Bloomsburg, you sign some paperwork, that's a contract of hire in Pennsylvania. However, we get other things, and this is a lot of trucking companies. Say the headquarters for the trucking company is in Houston. You find out about it on the internet. You type in an application. Someone calls you from Houston and says, well, we like your application. You seem to have the appropriate experience. We'd probably like to hire you, but you have to come down to Houston for a road test and a DOT physical and meet the guys or whatever. Mm-hmm. So you're really not hired yet. You get on a plane, you go to Houston. That's a contract of hire made in Texas. So when I try to decide whether there's Pennsylvania jurisdiction, we have to go through these fact-specific things.
Wow.
So, but say, for instance, you get hired on the internet without the need to go anywhere and do a test, then I'm going to argue, and there's case law to support this, that is a contract of hire made in Pennsylvania. So say you're going to work for a California company. You don't have to go out there. You just get hired on the internet. You got hired from your office in your home.
Yeah.
That's in Pennsylvania. So that could be Pennsylvania jurisdiction. If there's a contract of hire in Pennsylvania for work that is not localized in any state, that's the traveling employee. So you get hired to be an over-the-road trucker. You hit 20 states a week. Every state you're in, you're covered by Pennsylvania law.
Okay.
You may also be covered by Indiana law.
Okay.
You certainly are by Pennsylvania. Now, there are some exceptions and changes to this, and it's based primarily on one of the things that we see often in the trucking industry is the trucking companies want to control their workers' comp, so they want it all to be in the state where they are. So when you come to work for them, they make you sign something that says every injury will be decided under the laws of Illinois. Well, that is not enforceable in Pennsylvania. And often people will come to me after their claim has already been accepted in Illinois and they're getting benefits. And they come to me and I say, well, in Illinois, you only get paid half as much as in Pennsylvania. And in Illinois, they can stop your comp after 6 months without any notice. Pennsylvania law is much better. There's jurisdiction here because you got hurt here. It didn't have to be in Illinois. They just want to control it. So then they file in Pennsylvania. The claim gets accepted, and that's now takes over as the claim. So that often happens in the trucking and other traveling employee instances.
Let me understand that, Bill. So only one state has jurisdiction. So in the scenario you mentioned, you're talking about Illinois and Pennsylvania. If the jurisdiction gets changed to Pennsylvania so that the employee is covered in Pennsylvania, then that Illinois claim goes away?
Right.
Okay.
Because, most states, you can't get benefits from both at the same time.
Sure.
One at a time.
Okay.
That's why, people will come to me, and sometimes it's confusing. They'll say, well, I live in Philadelphia, and I got hurt in Vermont, but my case has been accepted in West Virginia. And I know exactly what's happening. They don't. But I'll say, there's a contract somewhere that you signed when you got hired saying all workers' comp cases will be processed through West Virginia. That doesn't necessarily benefit you. So
how about that?
Pennsylvania.
Okay. So you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of these arbitration clauses that we sign unknowingly. and limit our rights.
Arbitration clauses are very common in other areas of the law,
Yeah.
where you end up not even having access to the court.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they're trying to control everything. But thankfully, Pennsylvania law that will determine that that agreement is not binding on you. And if you have all the other requirements of a Pennsylvania case, you can file it.
Okay.
And we've done that many times. So now that's basically extraterritorial jurisdiction. And keep in mind that, and I'll touch on this later, but when we're talking about you got hired in Pennsylvania for a job that is not localized in any one state, that includes overseas. So,
wow.
And we'll talk about that later, but there's another aspect, because there's a lot of people who travel for their employment.
Yes.
So, and this isn't necessarily a jurisdictional thing. But
okay. So the traveling employee is covered.
Yeah, is the traveling employee covered? So there's a couple aspects to this, because whether you're inside of Pennsylvania or outside of Pennsylvania, the question is, at the time you are injured, are you in the course and scope of your employment? You have to be in the course and scope of your employment when you get hurt. You can't be at home thinking about going to work. In other words, there are exceptions to that. Say you're not at the workplace, but you're doing something that is, quote, in furtherance of the employer's interest. And there have been cases like this where someone's up all night working on a report, and they fall down the steps while they're carrying it, and they're found to be in the course and scope of their employment, even though they're in their basement. There's a famous case where a police officer shot himself accidentally while cleaning his gun at home. That was in furtherance of his employment. He needs a clean gun. Right. So anyway, so the question of whether people who are traveling are covered is one that we as attorneys would refer to as fact specific. That's why there are so many cases to determine whether or not you're in the course and scope of your employment, because the facts are all different. Yeah. Some of them are bizarre. You know, the things that people get into. So anyway, there's a couple principles that was started in 1977 with a case against U.S. Steel. It was determined that an employee, whether they're on the premises or off the premises of the employment, but they're actually engaged in a furtherance of the employer's business, or they're on the premises and they're hurt by a condition of the premises, even though they may not be actively working, they're covered. So this kind of creates two different cases where someone is off the premises, but they're doing something in furtherance of the business.
Okay.
We get or slip and fall cases. We get a lot of that.
Yeah.
You're done working. You're going to your car. You slip and fall.
Yeah.
You're not really at work, but you're on the premises, and then the ice caused you to slip. So that's also an accepted, or should be an accepted, workers' comp case.
Let me ask you about that, if I could. Just so you're finished. You're on the premises. You slip. Would that be strictly work comp, or would it be a third party?
That is a good question, and the answer is it depends. And here's why. Third party, of course, refers to cases where you can receive workers' comp and also sue someone who is not your employer. In that case, there's a possibility of both, depending on the circumstances. So say, for instance, your employer's premises is on a leased plot of land, and the owner is XYZ Real Estate Corporation, who's responsible for cleaning the snow and ice. You're still on the premises because it's within the lease, but this real estate company has undertaken legally the duty to clean those sidewalks and didn't do it.
Okay.
They're liable, potentially, in a third party. We also get, and I remember having this case, guy walking to his car, someone driving by in another car hits him. So he's got both a case against the driver and workers' comp case.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
All of this, as we get into this, you really need to have an attorney. There's no way the average person could sort these things out.
That's correct. And when I think about it, and when I get into it and I start reviewing these cases, I realize how complicated they are. And most of these cases only got finally accepted for the injured worker once all this testimony was put on. And that's, of course, one of the attorney's jobs is to determine what the testimony needs to be, who needs to testify, what facts need to be, etc. So you're right. That's absolutely true. I was reviewing some cases, and they seem to be very interesting. So, like cases where it was found that you were in furtherance of the business of the employer or not. And I will give you some examples. There was a case, and these are all cases that were found to be workers' comp. So an employee is bitten by a dog. The dog is owned by a coworker, but the employee was outside smoking. That was found to be workers' comp. Of course, that's not clear. It's not clear.
Right.
But what you'll see that one of the threads going through these cases is momentary breaks from your regular day or momentary diversions from serving the employer's interest don't take you out of the scope of employment.
Okay.
So, stationary employee was injured. And when I say stationary, I mean non-traveling in that case. But he was out at a salad bar and slipped and fell on some lettuce. However, it was found to be workers' comp because at that luncheon were clients. So it was a working lunch.
Okay.
So that was in furtherance. You get a lot, and for traveling employees, you get a lot of this too. So you're a salesperson and you got a team. So you leave Harrisburg and you decide you're going to go down to Baltimore and stay in a hotel, and then the next morning you're going to meet clients. Well, what if you go to dinner and you have a few beers and you and the guys get in the car and you pull out in front of someone? It's not your fault, but there's an accident. Is that work comp? And the general answer is yes. There's a case that said that a motor vehicle accident after stopping for dinner while traveling from one site to another to drop off a coworker is in furtherance. You're still at work. It's covered. So, momentary departures. You also get, like there was a case where someone was injured traveling but was in a bathroom. That doesn't necessarily, I wasn't in furtherance of whatever business, but everybody has to use the bathroom. So that momentary departure doesn't make you not at work.
Yeah, yeah.
So you get hurt in the bathroom, at some rest stop, still might be comp. Don't, foreclose that idea. And again, there was a case where someone worked and also had another office in his house, and he fell down the steps trying to get to the bathroom. Well, it's within the course and scope of his employment. Now, this one case I find really interesting. And I'd have to look into this in a little more detail. Employee was being arrested for stealing from his employer, and he was injured by the police. That's a work injury.
Wow.
That's an interesting case.
That's quite a stretch.
I know. I know.
Overall, are the work comp laws in Pennsylvania pretty good as compared to other states?
Right. We'll get into later some of the new developments trying to take away from that.
Okay.
But generally, when we talk about Pennsylvania as compared to other states, and even lawyers in other states will say to us that our law is superior, more protective. There are states that basically don't even have workers' comp anymore.
Wow.
That because here's the grand bargain. You can't sue your employer.
Right.
But you get the workers' comp protection. So if you take that workers' comp protection away, you can sue your employer for negligence.
I see.
But that's much harder because, a person gets hurt in Pennsylvania. In 3 weeks, they have a check in their hand.
Right.
If you have to sue your employer, it could be 2 years.
Right.
But that's
Okay,
That's a
interesting.
whole other discussion.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right, right.
What is this going and coming rule that I've heard about?
The going and coming rule also applies to whether you're in furtherance of the business or whether you're a traveling employee. So going and coming refers to going to work and coming home from work.
Okay.
Now, generally, for most of us who have a fixed place of work, once you leave and you get in your car and you're gone, you're no longer at work. You're no longer covered by workers' comp. However, there are exceptions to that. Now, one of the exceptions is you're a traveling employee. Okay, so you have no real fixed place of work, and there's a lot of people like this. Most of them are truckers.
Yeah.
Okay, so and or you have a contract with your employer, which includes transportation to and from work. In other words, and there's a lot of these people. You have a company car. If you have a company car, when you get in it and you leave your driveway, you're at work. So if you have an accident 200 feet from your house, you're covered. That's different than most people. That's an exception to the coming and going rule. So the other exceptions include you're on a special assignment for the employer. You're doing something in furtherance of their business. So morning comes, boss calls you at home, says, "Can you go by the bank and pick up, 200 rolls of pennies? We need them for this weekend." Sure. So as soon as you head to the bank, you're at work, even though
Right.
technically it's the going and coming rule. You're not yet at work, but
Okay.
you're furthering your employer's business.
Yeah. Okay.
Or say you weren't instructed, you didn't give an assignment, but you thought it would be a good idea to go by a coworker's house to see if he was coming in today and whether he had those tools that you need. So you're doing something in furtherance of your employment, even though you weren't asked to do it. You could still be considered at work if there's an accident of some type.
Interesting. Interesting. Now, what about if someone is injured in a foreign country? How does
Mm-hmm.
that?
So the extraterritorial provisions of the Workers' Comp Act that we discussed before were, first of all, there's a contract of hire in Pennsylvania, and for work that's either principally localized in Pennsylvania, like we discussed before, people like me who work in Pennsylvania, as soon as I go to New Jersey, I'm still covered.
Yeah.
Okay. But if the employment is not localized in any state or is for employment overseas, there is still, and when I say overseas, I mean Canada and anywhere else in the world.
Right.
So anywhere outside the United States, if you make the contract of hire. So
Okay.
now this becomes really complicated, and here's why. That's a general statement, and we don't see a lot of these cases. And the reason we don't see a lot of them is because there are other remedies. So say you work for a defense contractor, and it's in Pennsylvania. You get hired to be an engineer, and they send you to Afghanistan. And you get hurt in an accident over there. Technically, you have Pennsylvania jurisdiction, but there are other acts, and ones that we don't really deal with all that often, to protect you. There's an act that covers defense contractors when they're on military bases. So, a lot of military bases these days, overseas or wherever, are filled with private individuals.
Okay.
A lot of the things the military used to do, they now contract out.
I see.
Even during the Iraq War, and the bases were full of military contractors from Pizza Hut and Burger King, Subway, that would set up pop-up restaurants for the troops.
Oh,
So
yeah. Right.
these military bases are full of civilians. So technically, if they made a contract of hire in Pennsylvania, they could have Pennsylvania jurisdiction, but they may have other coverage. So, and that's true with people who were in the military as well.
Yeah.
But one of the other things you get is civilian people who are on ships or who are not in the United States anymore. They're on the high seas or whatever.
Yeah.
There are laws to protect them. Technically, if they made a contract of hire in Philadelphia and got on a ship and was headed to Africa, they would have coverage. But there's things like the Jones Act. The Jones Act protects people at sea, everybody if you get hurt. And the Longshoremen's Act protects people basically closer to shore, but they could also be on the water. So there's protection. That's why, and those benefits are generally better. We don't see them that often in the comp arena, but there is that jurisdiction. There's another thing I came across and I thought was really interesting. It's a Pennsylvania law that affects only Pennsylvania National Guardsmen. So there's a whole separate set of compensation if you get hurt in the Pennsylvania National Guard. And it's just like comp, but and if you get hurt or killed, they have their own schedule of benefits.
And when that happens, no, that's okay. When that happens, are they covered? Is it like, do they get coverage under both situations, the National Guardsman and work comp, or is it one or the other?
It's considered exclusive, so they get only it's called the Military Code of Pennsylvania. It's under that. That's all they're entitled to, and I found that very interesting. And I was reading it, and one of the exceptions to that coverage is if they get hurt in service of the United States. So, as you've seen before, when there's war or police action, they often call up the National Guard. National Guard, then, there were a lot of them in Iraq.
Yeah.
And if they get hurt during that conflict, they're not covered under this law.
Okay.
They're covered, of course, under other federal laws. That's why. Right. We talked about this before, about how anyone who's injured by an act of war is not covered under the Pennsylvania Workers' Comp Act. So that's kind of
right.
the same thing with that.
Great information. Well, Bill, let me ask you this before we go. How about anything new going on in the law relative to workers' compensation in Pennsylvania?
Well, there is. And, for a number of months now, there have been several bills pending in the Pennsylvania General Assembly. One of the bills is called evidence-based medicine. That's the subject, and it applies to workers' comp cases. So I've discussed this before, but just as a refresher, it is evidence-based medicine creates a formula. That formula has to be used when someone is given a prescription. So the doctors who treat injured workers must go by a formula now. They can only prescribe certain things in certain amounts for certain conditions. And if they don't do that, it's not going to be paid by the work comp carrier.
Oh, wow.
So, very contentious. And it recently passed by 1 or 2 votes. And as I'm told, it's currently on the governor's desk. And I asked someone, was he going to sign it? And it's not clear whether he is or not.
Yeah.
But one of the things that came out recently about this, and there was a debate about it, is because, like a lot of politics, some of these things are pushed strictly for financial interest. And behind all this are companies. There's always a company that can benefit from a government action. This is no exception. So there's 2 companies basically in the country that are involved with that as evidence-based medicine. So if a state passes it, they have to hire one of these 2 companies to set up the system.
Okay.
And create the formula and update it and service it. I guess it becomes a long-term government contract.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, one of these companies is owned by an insurance company.
Oh.
So, talk about a conflict of interest.
Right. Wow.
Insurance companies are going to create a formula whereby it is determined how much insurance companies have to pay.
Oh, my word.
That's problematic. It's problematic. It's sitting on the governor's desk. So what's going to happen with that? We don't know.
Interesting.
The other thing about, I'm going to go to a seminar on this soon, about medical marijuana in Pennsylvania, because this evidence-based medicine, I don't know if it'll even include that there'll be somewhere on a schedule that you can give people medical marijuana for pain. I don't know. But of course, medical marijuana is now legal in Pennsylvania, and doctors can generally prescribe certain forms of it for certain conditions. But how will that change? I don't know. Because this whole idea of medical marijuana is a developing area for attorneys, and there are a lot of seminars to discuss.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting.
What to do. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, Bill, listen, if somebody has questions specifically about workers' compensation issues, how can they reach you at your office?
Right. We have an 800 number, and you can call that from anywhere in the state. And it's 1-800-518-4529. So that's 1-800-518-4LAW. And you'll speak to someone, and you tell them your problem, and they'll take the information, and then you'll get to speak to an attorney.
Okay, and then we have, I believe, O'ConnorLaw.com.
Right. You can see us on the web at O'ConnorLaw.com. There's a lot of information on there. Some videos, things to read, attorney profiles.
Great. Well, Bill, thanks for your time today. This is great information.
You're welcome. Good to see you, and take care.
You too. To those of you that are watching, if you have questions or comments, you can leave them right on this page. We'll get back to you, answer your questions, and we appreciate you tuning in today. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.